Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church and our ongoing study in The Spiritual Gift of Madness by Dr. Seth Farber, published in 2012. Let's go to block 1. We're going to look at pages 57 to 76. Okay, block 1. Today's biochemical imbalance model. Protesting against the psychiatric profession took place in July 2003 by an 8-member group of drug therapy survivors. Public exchange and dialogue resulted. The psychiatric professionals posited the theory that mental illness was caused by biological and chemical disorders in the brain, without any factual evidence to back up that proposal. Biological disorder theory. The Freudian model has imprinted most of the 20th century, which emphasized childhood trauma. That model has been rejected today. Instead, mental health professionals are leaning heavily on the biochemical imbalance theory. Now, the biochemical imbalance theory, says Farber, is an empty premise. It was promoted in the 1990s by very heavy advertising by the psychiatric and by the pharmaceutical complex, declaring that biological abnormalities are the cause of mental illness, without factual data to back that up. Now, the real reason for this posited position was obviously financial benefit for psychiatry, financial benefit for pharmaceutical professionals. Let's go on to block 2. The current myth of mental illness. Dr. Farber calls it a myth, and this myth of mental illness should be challenged by genuine Christian theology. Marketplace-driven mythology. Psychiatry needed to embrace the myth of the biopsychiatric model to prosper in the marketplace. Advertisement campaigns in the 1990s reinforced the myth. And even psychiatric research today is funded by drug companies in order to continue to sell the biopsychiatric model. So research funding is coming from the pharmaceutical companies. Now, block 2, note 2, emotional problems are now corrected by medication. And Dr. Farber says this is scientific heresy in order to reinforce the myth of mental illness. Psychiatry posits its defense of fantasy, and they have invented 300 new mental diseases. Without any empirical verification. So, what do we mean by the myth of mental illness? It's reinforced by the propaganda machine promoting the biopsychiatric, and that should be biochemical psychiatric model, without evidence, based on a collective imagination. And it has become an obsession in the Western culture, says Dr. Farber. But then he says, Christ stood radically for the worth of every human soul. This was later compromised in the 4th century by the Roman Catholic Western Church. Again, Dr. Farber brings up this identity issue. Instead of medical identity, we should promote equal existential identity. He brings that up again. But the myth, obviously there is such a thing as mental illness, but the myth of mental illness is to declare it biochemical, and to declare that it must be treated with a regimen of drugs. That's the myth that he's talking about. Obviously, mental illness is a reality, but the myth is declaring it exclusively biochemical. To declare mental illness as biochemical and then to prescribe a multiple drug regimen of drugs to supposedly correct chemical imbalance, all in collusion with pharmaceutical companies who are paying for any future research. Let's go on to Block 3, the antidepressant problem of addiction. Protest continues, but psychiatry professionals continue to promote the myth of brain chemical imbalance. Consequently, antidepressant prescriptions have doubled since 1998. So the trend today is to prescribe antidepressant prescriptions, and they have doubled since 1998. Therefore, potential for addiction has also doubled since 1998. And the true interrelated factors for mental illness and mental disorders are environment, stress, personality, social support, and injury. Genuine recovery comes from love and support of friends and family, period, says Dr. Farber. So we've really gotten to the point where we just automatically put people on antidepressants. And under the guise that mental disorders are due to biochemical imbalance. Dr. Farber says that is a myth, and that's why he talks about the myth of mental illness, because if you call it biochemical imbalance, that's not the truth. So when he refers to the myth of mental illness, he means specifically the myth of the current definition of mental illness as biochemical imbalance. That is what he is protesting in his manuscript. The current posited equation that mental illness equals biochemical imbalance. That is what his manuscript does protest. Let's do a quick recap. Okay, block 1. It's got to be note 3. The biochemical imbalance theory is an empty premise. It was promoted by heavy advertising in the 1990s, paid for by pharmaceutical companies, and without factual data. The sole reason was financial benefit for psychiatry, financial benefit for pharmaceutical companies. That was the motivation. The motivation was financial benefit. Block 2, Dr. Farber calls the biochemical imbalance theory the myth of mental illness. That is your equated protest. Obviously, there is mental illness. The myth of mental illness is to declare it biochemical imbalance. Block 2, note 3. The myth of mental illness has been reinforced by advertising propaganda without evidence, based on collective imagination, and it's become an obsession. Now we obsessively prescribe antidepressant drugs. And the real cause of mental illness is interrelated and multidimensional. But Christ and Dr. Farber does bring up Christ, he stood radically for existential equality, the worth of every human soul. That was compromised in the 4th century, and it is compromised again today by the biochemical imbalance theory. Very much compromised. So finally, block 3 and D and E. In reality, mental disorders are due to 5 interrelated multidimensional factors. Social environment. Today's social environment causes a lot of disjointedness. Social environment, stress, personality, social support, injury. The injury of a stroke can cause terrible depression, can cause mental illness. And then Dr. Farber says genuine recovery comes from love and support of family and friends. That's where genuine recovery comes from. So in this lesson, Dr. Farber continues the description and the depiction of the problem. And the problem is block 2, the title. Today's problem is we are treating people with the underlying myth of mental illness, which is the myth that mental illness is due to exclusively biochemical imbalance, therefore automatically prescribe antidepressant drugs. The myth of mental illness is today's huge problem, reinforced by advertising, all for the sole purpose of financial gain for psychiatry, financial gain for pharmaceutical companies. So that's an additional lesson on what is the problem, pages 57 to 76. Next lesson will be pages 76 to 86. Next lesson, 76 to 86.